relationships are just complicated, and you can not want to be with somebody but still find them attractive in other ways. And, it's complicated, right?
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Some marriages end with a press tour of accusations. Others end so quietly that most people forget they happened at all. Scarlett Johansson and Ryan Reynolds belong firmly to the second category. They married in their 20s, divorced within a few years, and then did something almost unheard of in Hollywood. They simply stopped talking about it. For more than a decade, tabloids filled that silence with unnamed sources and secondhand gossip, while the two people who actually lived through the marriage said almost nothing on the record. Then, during a relaxed conversation on a friend's podcast, Johansson finally opened the door a crack, and what came out was not bitterness or blame, but something closer to affection. In this video, we're going to walk through how that marriage began, why it ended, and what Johansson's own words years later reveal about a chapter of her life she spent a long time keeping to herself. To understand why the eventual divorce felt so surprising to outsiders, it helps to understand how quickly the relationship moved in the first place. Scarlett Johansson was born in Manhattan in November 1984, the child of a Danish father who worked as an architect and an American mother from a Bronx family. She grew up in a large household, started acting as a child, and had already built a serious resume by her teenage years, most notably with her breakout performance in Sofia Coppola's Lost in Translation in 2003, a role that established her as one of the most talked-about young actresses of her generation almost overnight. Ryan Reynolds, meanwhile, had taken a different route into fame. Born in Vancouver in 1976, he cut his teeth on Canadian television before landing a recurring role on the American sitcom Two Guys and a Girl in the late 1990s. From there he moved into studio comedies, building a public image around quick, self-deprecating humor that would eventually become his signature. By the mid-2000s, he had also just come out of a high-profile engagement to musician Alanis Morissette, a relationship that ended not long before he and Johansson crossed paths. Johansson and Reynolds began dating in 2007, and by most accounts, things escalated quickly. They were engaged within roughly a year of getting together, a pace that reportedly surprised even people close to them, since both were known for guarding their personal lives closely. Johansson has said in past interviews that she trusted her instincts at the time and felt that the relationship had grown naturally into something serious, rather than being rushed for the sake of it. Whatever the internal reasoning, the couple married in September 2008 in a private ceremony in Vancouver that was kept so quiet that even seasoned entertainment reporters were caught off guard. There was no red carpet, no official wedding photographer statement, and almost no advance word that a wedding was even being planned. Johansson was 23. Reynolds was 31. What followed the wedding was a period in which both of their careers took off in ways that would eventually define the next 2 decades of their professional lives. Johansson joined the Marvel Cinematic Universe as Natasha Romanoff, debuting as Black Widow in Iron Man 2 in 2010, a role that would keep her tied to one of the most successful franchises in film history for years to come. Reynolds, around the same time, was preparing to headline Green Lantern, a film that would end up mattering far more for his personal life than his career, since it was on that set that he met Blake Lively, the woman who would eventually become his second wife. As both of their public profiles grew, their marriage was, ironically, unfolding almost entirely out of view. That pattern of privacy did not survive the marriage itself, but it did set the template for how both of them would handle its end, quietly, and without turning it into a public spectacle. That restraint is a large part of why, more than 15 years later, people are still curious about what actually happened between them. Part of what makes the pairing interesting in hindsight is just how different their public personas were even then. Johansson, in the years leading up to the marriage, had built a reputation as a serious, somewhat guarded actress who gravitated toward auteur-driven films and rarely offered much of herself to the press beyond what was required to promote a project. Reynolds, by contrast, had already begun cultivating the wisecracking, magazine cover charisma that would eventually make him one of the most quotable actors of his generation, a persona built on rapid-fire humor and a willingness to poke fun at himself in ways few of his peers attempted. On paper, they looked like an odd match, the introspective indie darling and the affable comedic leading man. In practice, According to people who knew them at the time, that contrast seemed to work in their favor early on, with each apparently drawn to qualities in the other that they didn't see much of in themselves. Their engagement and wedding also arrived at a moment when both were still, relatively speaking, on the way up rather than already established as the era-defining stars they would later become. Johansson had not yet joined the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Reynolds had not yet become Deadpool, a character he would not step into for years, and that would not become his defining role until the 2016 film finally saw daylight after a long and famously difficult road to production. Neither of them had built the massive global fame that would later make even small comments about their personal lives newsworthy. That timing matters, because it means the marriage itself took place largely before either of them had to contend with the kind of constant scrutiny that defines A-list Hollywood life today, even if the divorce that followed would eventually be picked apart under exactly that kind of scrutiny in hindsight. From the outside, the hushed wedding seemed to promise a stable future, and plenty of fans assumed they already knew how the story would go. They were wrong. Behind the scenes, tension was already building, and the version of events that eventually reached the public would be built almost entirely on rumor rather than anything either of them confirmed. To understand what really happened, we need to go back to the years right after the wedding, when the marriage first began to unravel. By 2010, signs of strain were becoming difficult to ignore. The couple separated that year, and in December 2010, they confirmed the split through a brief joint statement, describing a decision reached after careful consideration and framing the relationship as one that had begun and ended with mutual respect. The divorce was finalized in 2011, closing out a marriage that had lasted just under 3 years. In the vacuum left by their silence, tabloids did what tabloids do. Unnamed sources painted Reynolds as more traditional and controlling in his expectations of the relationship, while Johansson was cast as increasingly independent and frustrated by the constraints of married life. Other reports claimed there had been visible tension on set visits during that period, including one widely repeated but never confirmed account describing a tense visit to the set of one of Reynolds' films. None of these details were ever validated by either Johansson or Reynolds, and in the years since, both have largely declined to confirm or deny the specifics of any of it, leaving the popular narrative around their divorce built almost entirely on secondhand gossip, rather than anything either party actually said. What stands out looking back is how little either of them tried to control that narrative in real time. Neither gave a tell-all interview. Neither used the divorce as material for a public feud or a string of pointed interviews. The joint statement they released was, by celebrity divorce standards, unusually restrained, focused on mutual respect rather than blame, and that restraint carried through the following decade, even as outside speculation kept filling the space they left empty. Reynolds did occasionally acknowledge, in general terms, that the divorce had been a painful period, describing it in past interviews as something that hurt in the moment, but that a person eventually works through rather than something that defines the rest of their life. He also had a habit of deflecting from the subject with humor, at one point joking about a particularly rough stretch of filming that included a flooded hotel room, a sick dog, and a difficult divorce all happening around the same time, treating the breakup as just one more indignity in an already chaotic period rather than dwelling on it directly. It was a classic Reynolds move. Acknowledge the difficulty, then pivot to a joke before anyone could push further. Johansson, for her part, said almost nothing publicly about the marriage for years. She moved forward with her career and her personal life without directly addressing what had gone wrong, and that pattern held steady even as speculation about the relationship kept circulating. Her next chapter played out just as quietly in terms of the Reynolds marriage specifically. She married French journalist Romain Doriac in 2014. The same year, the couple welcomed their daughter, Rose, and that marriage ended in divorce in 2017. Even as she moved through an entirely separate relationship and its ending, the subject of her marriage to Reynolds remained something she simply did not discuss on the record. It felt less like a secret she was protecting, and more like a chapter she had already closed for herself long before the public ever got the chance to ask about it directly. It's also worth noting how differently each of them handled the broader question of privacy once their profiles grew even larger in the years after the divorce. Johansson became famously protective of details about her family life, rarely discussing her children by name in interviews for long stretches and generally steering conversations away from anything that felt like an invitation for tabloids to dig further. Reynolds took almost the opposite approach with his second marriage, frequently joking about fatherhood and family life on social media and in interviews, though almost always in a way that kept the actual substance of his relationships private behind a wall of humor. Both approaches, different as they were, seemed to serve the same underlying goal: keeping the real texture of their personal lives out of public hands, even while appearing to be open books in every other way. That contrast became especially clear whenever journalists tried to get either of them to revisit the marriage directly in the years that followed. Reporters occasionally attempted to ask Reynolds about the relationship during press tours for unrelated projects, and he would typically respond with a joke or a brief, generic acknowledgement that the past was the past before steering the conversation elsewhere. Johansson, when asked similar questions, tended to simply decline to engage with the subject at all, treating it less as something painful to avoid and more as something that simply was not relevant to whatever she happened to be promoting at the time. Neither approach gave outlets much to work with, which is precisely why unnamed sources and second-hand claims filled so much of the coverage for so long. There was a real story there, but for more than a decade, almost none of it came from the two people who had actually lived it. That quiet held for well over a decade. It took an unscripted moment on a podcast, years later, to finally crack it open even slightly. The shift happened in April 2023, when Johansson appeared as a guest on Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop podcast. The two actresses know each other from years of overlap in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and the conversation eventually drifted into more personal territory when Paltrow asked how many times Johansson had actually been married. Paltrow guessed 2. Johansson corrected her, saying the real number was 3. And Paltrow's reaction suggested she had genuinely forgotten that Reynolds had ever been part of the picture at all, treating the realization almost like a missed opportunity to bring it up sooner. What followed was warmer than most listeners expected. Johansson acknowledged that the marriage to Reynolds had not lasted long, but she also noted that it overlapped with the earliest days of her friendship with Paltrow, around the time she was filming Iron Man 2. When Paltrow mentioned that she and her circle were fans of Reynolds, Johansson agreed without hesitation, describing him in simple, positive terms as a genuinely good person. There was no tension in her voice, no hedging, and no sense that this was a subject she was being forced to address. It came across as an honest, almost offhand reflection rather than a calculated statement. The same conversation gave Johansson room to talk more broadly about how her approach to relationships had changed since her 20s. She suggested that in her earlier relationships, including the one with Reynolds, she had not yet learned how to identify her own needs or set clear boundaries with a partner, and that it was only once she developed that kind of self-respect and self-knowledge that a relationship, like the one she eventually built with her current husband, Colin Jost, became possible. It was less a critique of Reynolds specifically, and more an honest acknowledgement that she had been a different, less self-assured person in her 20s, and that the marriage reflected where she was in her own growth at the time, rather than any particular flaw in him. It's worth laying out the fuller picture of her romantic history that came up in that same conversation, since it puts the Reynolds marriage in context. After Reynolds, Johansson married Romaine Doriak in 2014, and the two share their daughter, Rose, born that same year, before separating in 2017. She then married Saturday Night Live cast member Colin Jost in 2020, and the couple share a son, Cosmo, born in 2021. Jost has remained a fixture on Weekend Update for years and has occasionally referenced his wife's career on air, and the marriage has generally been described in the press as notably calmer and lower drama than her earlier relationships, something Johansson has attributed to simply understanding herself far better by the time she and Jost got together. Part of what made this Goop podcast moment land the way it did was exactly how casual it was. Johansson was not sitting down for an exclusive interview about her past marriage, and she was not making any kind of formal announcement. She was correcting a friend's math in the middle of an unrelated conversation about relationships, and the warmth toward Reynolds slipped out almost as an aside rather than a rehearsed talking point. That informality is likely why the clip resonated the way it did and kept circulating in entertainment coverage for months afterward, treated by many outlets as the closest thing the public had ever gotten to real closure on that chapter of her life. Entertainment outlets picked the clip apart in the days and weeks that followed, and much of the coverage focused less on the content of what Johansson said and more on the tone. There was no defensiveness in it, no sense that she was choosing her words carefully to avoid a headline. Compare that to how most celebrity exes address old relationships, often through a carefully worded statement released by a publicist or a single controlled line dropped into a much larger interview about a new project. And it becomes clearer why this moment stood out. Johansson wasn't managing her image in that exchange. She was talking to a friend, and Reynolds' name simply came up along the way. It also mattered that the comment arrived at a point in both of their lives when neither had anything obvious to gain from softening the story. Johansson was, by 2023, several years into a stable marriage with Colin Jost and firmly established as one of the most successful actresses in film history, with no career need to revisit an old relationship for publicity. Reynolds, for his part, was deep into one of the most successful stretches of his career, juggling the Deadpool franchise, his business ventures, and his ownership stake in Wrexham AFC, with no particular incentive to comment on or react to whatever Johansson said about their marriage. The warmth in her comments, in other words, wasn't strategic. It read as simply true, which is likely why it traveled as far as it did. That single unscripted exchange did more to reshape how people understood the Reynolds marriage than more than a decade of tabloid speculation had managed. But it also raises an obvious question. How do the two of them actually get along today, now that both have moved on so publicly into new families and very different careers? There's no public evidence of any lingering tension between Johansson and Reynolds in the years since their divorce. Reynolds went on to marry Blake Lively in 2012, and the two have since built one of the more high-profile families in Hollywood, sharing 4 children together. For a long time, persistent rumors suggested that his relationship with Lively might have started while he was still married to Johansson, fueled largely by a tabloid report describing the two of them together in a way that looked romantic shortly after the Johansson divorce was announced. Reynolds has offered his own account of how the Lively relationship actually began, explaining that the two of them were friends first after meeting on the set of Green Lantern, and that anything romantic only developed roughly a year later, once both were single, kicked off somewhat awkwardly during a double date, where they each ended up paired with other people entirely. There has never been any confirmed evidence that the relationship with Lively began before his marriage to Johansson ended, and Johansson herself has spoken warmly, if briefly, about Reynolds on more than one occasion since that Goop podcast appearance, generally describing him in positive terms without revisiting the details of the marriage itself. Reynolds' life since the divorce has moved in a very public direction in almost every other respect. Beyond his family with Lively, he has built a business portfolio that extends well past acting, including Aviation American Gin, in which he sold a majority stake to Diageo in 2020, and the mobile carrier Mint Mobile, sold to T-Mobile in a deal that closed in 2023. In 2021, he and actor Rob McElhenney purchased the Welsh football club Wrexham AFC, turning the team's rise through the English football pyramid into the subject of a widely watched documentary series. On screen, he returned to his signature role opposite Hugh Jackman's Wolverine in 2024's Deadpool and Wolverine, which became one of the highest-grossing films of that year. More recently, Reynolds and Lively have found themselves at the center of a highly publicized legal dispute connected to Lively's film It Ends With Us, involving her co-star and director, a situation entirely separate from anything involving Johansson, but one that has kept Reynolds' personal life in the headlines well into 2026. Johansson's own path since the divorce has stayed rooted primarily in film. Beyond her long run in the Marvel franchise, she has taken on prestige dramatic work in films like Marriage Story and Jojo Rabbit, both released in 2019, and expanded into directing with her feature debut, Eleanor the Great, starring June Squibb, which premiered in 2025. She has also picked up producing credits, including on 2024's Fly Me to the Moon, and continues developing projects through her production company, including television work currently in progress. By 2026, she had become recognized as the highest-grossing lead actress in film history, with her body of work collectively earning well over $15 billion worldwide, and she has continued to rank among the highest-paid actors in Hollywood in recent years, building her wealth through a combination of Marvel paychecks, endorsement deals, and her skincare brand. The outset. Neither Johansson nor Reynolds has ever suggested any lingering animosity toward the other, and the overall picture that has emerged, especially since 2023, is one of two people who married young, learned something from the experience, and eventually found a way to speak about it with far more ease than bitterness. Johansson has spoken more broadly, in other interviews, about the general difficulty of maintaining a relationship with another actor, referencing the logistical strain of two demanding careers moving at different paces, comments that many outlets have connected back to her years with Reynolds even though she has not named him directly in that context. There's also something worth sitting with in how differently this story could have unfolded. Celebrity marriages that end quickly and quietly often become permanent punchlines, revisited every time either party makes headlines for something unrelated, with old wounds reopened for clicks regardless of whether either person has actually moved past them. Johansson and Reynolds largely avoided that fate, not because the tabloids didn't try, but because neither of them ever gave the story enough fuel to keep burning on its own. No competing interviews, no dueling narratives, no years later social media jabs, just two careers that kept climbing, two new families that formed independently of each other, and eventually one warm, unscripted comment that did more to settle the record than a decade of guesswork ever could. It's a reminder, too, of how much of what the public thinks it knows about a celebrity relationship is often built on almost nothing at all. For more than 10 years, the story of why Johansson and Reynolds' marriage ended was shaped almost entirely by unnamed sources, tabloid speculation, and assumptions filled in by outlets that had no actual insight into what happened behind closed doors. It took one relaxed, unplanned exchange on a podcast to reveal that the truth was far less dramatic than anything that had been reported, and far kinder than most people expected. Sometimes the real ending to a Hollywood story isn't a bombshell. It's just two people who quietly moved on, and years later, said so with a smile instead of a headline. That, more than any single quote from a podcast, may be the real story here. Not a dramatic falling out, and not a secret finally spilled after years of hiding, but two people whose careers quietly outgrew a marriage that neither of them ever tried to use against the other. Two people who, by all public evidence, simply grew into different lives, built new families, and left the door open to speak kindly about the brief chapter they once shared. And maybe that's the real lesson buried in this whole story, the one that gets lost every time it gets reduced to a divorce and a decade of silence. Two people got married too young, figured out relatively quickly that it wasn't going to work, and instead of turning that realization into a public war, they simply let it go and let themselves grow. It took years for the world to catch up to that reality, but once it did, courtesy of one honest laugh on a podcast couch, the story finally matched the people who lived it. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Scarlett Johansson and Ryan Reynolds' story is one of those Hollywood chapters that only makes sense once you slow down and look at the full timeline, because the most important parts of it were never the loudest ones. If this video taught you something you didn't already know, consider sharing it with someone who would find it interesting. Like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Let us know in the comments what you think about how Scarlett Johansson has handled this chapter of her life. We read every comment. See you in the next video.